Hello everyone. This video is going to be going over what the genre conventions of A3 are. So that's a stakeholder proposal. So we're going to be going over what we mean by genre conventions, or what we mean by genre, and then what those conventions are for a proposal like the one that you will be writing. So let's start by just defining genre. What does that even mean when we say a genre? And often when we think of genres, we tend to think of the kind of categories in something like movies or music. So action, romance, comedy, or for music, pop, country, hip hop, whatever that is. And those are these different categories that can kind of define different types of these texts, right? If we're thinking of a movie as a text or a song as a text that we can kind of analyze, then these are those different categories that we can put those texts into, defined by their different characteristics. So we could sort of define genre as a category or a classification of a certain medium characterized by common elements, because the way that we come up with these genres is by grouping together different movies or different songs that have a lot of the same elements and same characteristics. So that's how we can kind of define what a genre is. And so if we're sticking with movie genres, how do we know the differences between these types of genres then? Because if they're all movies, then how are they different? Well, we have different expectations for what these different genres will have in them and what we can expect to see. So for example, in a romance movie, the kind of things we would expect to see are probably something joyful, right? It's probably a happy narrative. There's probably a couple that are flirting or courting each other. There's usually some comedy and some laughter, and it generally has a happy ending, right? That's the kind of things that we can usually expect from a romance movie. Whereas with a horror movie, we expect very different things, right? We expect suspense and fear. You expect to be scared. There's probably gore or death, and definitely some kind of enemy. So much different feeling from a romance movie to a horror movie. And there's those different expectations and different things that make up those different genres. So what these expectations are called are genre conventions. So that's what we're referring to when we say genre conventions, are the elements of different genres that we can expect to see in those different things. So we can think of genre as these different kinds of narratives, but genre can also refer to just different mediums and different formats of text. So when we're thinking of writing genres, you could think of something like a novel being a different genre than a poem, and which is different from an essay or a textbook. And because the format and the expectations and conventions of a novel is going to be very different from the format of a textbook, which is very different from the format of a poem. So there's these different conventions of these different types of text that we can classify. But there's also things that you may not have thought of as writing genres, like emails or text messages or tweets, letters, anything like that. Those are also still genres that have their own sets of expectations and conventions, right? So like an email is going to be very different from a text message. An email tends to be more formal, more structured, whereas a text message is sort of informal, which is going to be very different from a handwritten letter. So there's all different kinds of genres within writing that just are characterized by those different conventions and those different expectations that we have. So I want us to think about then if knowing what genre conventions do to a rhetorical situation. So here I've got these two thank you notes. And both of them are doing the same things. They have the same rhetorical purpose in thanking, and they kind of have very similar messages, but the genre of a text message versus a handwritten note are very different. So if we look over here at this text message, this one is saying, "Thank you for your order from Sally's Shoes." So this is a text message from a business. And the kind of conventions going on with this text over here, it's a digital medium, so it's not handwritten or anything. It sounds like it's something that might be kind of automated. It doesn't really sound like a person wrote it. And it's kind of impersonal, right? There's no names. It's not addressed to or from anybody, just the business. And it sounds pretty formal, right? It's just saying, "We will get back to you within working hours. Thank you for your order." It's very professional. Whereas if we look over here to this thank you note, which is again doing something very similar within the actual content, this is a handwritten note addressed to Aunt Mary, thanking her for the graduation present of some champagne flutes. And so the kind of conventions that are happening with this letter are that it is handwritten, it's a physical piece of paper, and it's very personal, right? This is addressed specifically to Aunt Mary, so there's clearly a familial relationship here. It's very heartfelt, the person writing this seems very grateful for the graduation present. It's very specific about what was given, whereas this one kind of wasn't. So these are, again, just two very different genres that have very different conventions that are kind of at play here. And what that does to the rhetorical situation, it really changes everything. So if we're looking at the rhetorical situation of that text message, purpose would be to thank and maybe to encourage further business. The context is that some kind of transaction has taken place between a customer and a business. The author is simply the business, and where they're kind of coming from is that they care about their sales and their business. And the audience is whoever the customer was. And there's not really a personal connection between author and audience because that's just not what the genre of a formal text message from business to customer really calls for. That's not really part of the conventions. Whereas if we look at the rhetorical situation of that handwritten note, again, the purpose is to thank, but everything else is different. So the context is that there's a graduation happening, but there's also the familial connection that already exists. There's a celebration happening. The author is whoever has graduated, but is a family member. And where they're coming from as an author is that they would care about that relationship to their audience, which is Aunt Mary, who, again, is a family member that they have a personal connection with. So, again, the genre of the handwritten note kind of calls for a personalized touch between author and audience, which also affects the purpose, which is not just to thank, but to connect to the family. So, even though this purpose is the same and much of the content of the two texts were the same, everything else about these rhetorical situations has completely changed. So knowing your genre and the conventions of that genre really affect everything else. That's why genre is kind of at the center of this model, is that it really dictates everything else about how you're writing. So, what does this have to do with you and with assignment 3? Well, we're moving from A2 to A3, which is moving from a research paper to a proposal. So A3 is a very different genre than A2 was and has, therefore, different genre conventions that you are going to have to be aware of and kind of operating within because, again, it affects your whole rhetorical situation. So if we think back to kind of what the conventions of a research paper were or are, like A2 was, it's making some kind of argumentative claim that's backed up by evidence. You would expect in a research paper to see lots of citations, lots of sources and evidence. It probably followed the classic argument structure of, intro to key points to conclusion. And the way it kind of looks in terms of the medium of a academic research paper is kind of just big blocks of text, right? You just had nothing on the page but the argument itself, just the words. And then there were those sort of formatting conventions of the font and the double spacing and MLA. And those are kind of the expectations that you would have for a research paper. And those are not necessarily going to be the same things as A3 because a proposal is a totally different genre. So what are some of the expectations? What are some of the conventions of a proposal? In the proposal, you're still going to be making an argumentative claim. This is still a persuasive genre, so you're still wanting to focus on convincing your audience. But now, you're not only making an argument, you're also trying to convince your stakeholder to take action and to adopt the plan that you're going to come up with. So also, as far as just what proposals are and what those conventions are, they are really concise, straightforward, professional, and assertive. So whereas in a research paper, you can kind of spend as much time as you need really going through and parsing out your different points, a proposal needs to be straightforward and quick and just straight to the point and very assertive. And so within your paper, you need to not just have some kind of argument, but a plan of action. So you need to come up with what those steps are going to be, and actually lay it out for your audience and say, here's the plan, and research what that means that you need, what the resources are going to be, in terms of budget, materials. You've got to have that so that your audience knows exactly what the plan is. Proposals are broken up into sections, so you probably didn't have like section headings in your A2, but in A3 you will, to really kind of clearly lead your audience through each piece. And those sections are usually pretty concise. So you'll have, a section on like explaining the background and the argument for why you're making this proposal, but even that needs to be pretty just straight to the point. And you'll be making these points addressed directly to your audience. So in A2, you likely didn't say you, and you really should be in a proposal, because you want to be assertive, right? And so you want to say, hey, stakeholder, you should do this. You should adopt my plan. Proposals also use visuals, so you need to have some kind of visual element in your proposal. So that means like a chart or a graph or a photo or a map or something like that. And then you'll also be addressing counterarguments. Again, this was something that was not required in A2, and it is required in A3, because one of the key conventions of a proposal is acknowledging the concerns that other people might have and sort of counteracting them. So that's another thing that is really key for what is expected in a proposal. So these are some of the things that are expected conventions that will be in your paper. And again, part of the reason why it's so important to know what these conventions are is because it's key to appealing to your audience, right? It affects your whole rhetorical situation. So you want to think about how those different sections and how you're laying out your proposal, how you can use those to appeal to your audience using ethos, logos, and pathos, and then how you're going to utilize those conventions to connect to your audience, and how it affects your purpose as well. So what I'd like you to do to get a stronger sense of what proposals really are and what they really look like is to go look through some. So I don't want you don't have to read all the way through, but I'd like you to skim some proposals that I've put together for you. So in the description down below this video, there are some links to some sample proposals, and just go through those and kind of see what do they look like. So what are the different sections, and what is their function? Maybe see if there's any that you see in more than one. How are those proposals appealing to their audience, and how are those conventions working? And also, just how is it different from a research paper? You know what research papers look like. You know what general essays look like. So how are these proposals different from that? And what do you think are some of the conventions that you're seeing there? Okay, so if you have any questions on the genre conventions of a proposal, please feel free to reach out to me. And I will also be giving you a list of some of the required sections of a proposal, but feel free to look back at this video as much as you need.